I want to just, you really need no introduction to this group because we've been reading the book for the past couple of weeks. And you know what we're here for. I think we also sent you the study questions that we've been pondering. So I would just turn it over to you for 15-20 minutes to talk about the book, whatever you would like to bring to us, and then we can just jump into a conversation, if that's okay.
Yeah, fantastic. So I want to lift up a few things that I think are usually important to contextualize the book, because I started with some assumptions that maybe destabilize the normal assumptions that the whole conversation about global warming is occurring, and and part of that is actually providing the context for why the discussion is happening at all, right? Which we kind of are just like people like us who are concerned with the world. It's very natural to us that there would be a conversation going on at all levels of the society about global warming, right? And so I think it's actually useful to think about that in terms of why exactly this conversation has risen to prominence in the current moment, because we know very well that, in fact, the global warming issue has been very well known to natural scientists and the ruling class, frankly, who are plenty intelligent and are reading the same natural scientists that we read. They're just ignoring it, right? Including, it's been very well known to the oil companies for quite some time exactly what's going on, right? I'm just switching my device, if you can let in my other device. Sorry to interrupt the flow. Okay.
Recording in progress.
Okay, sorry about that. So what is the context, right? And I think there's a few interlocking contexts. I mean, one of them is the destabilization of capitalism as a mode of political rule. Now, I don't mean as a mode of power itself, where I think capitalism is doing absolutely fine, more or less. But I do think capitalism is destabilized ideologically speaking, that it has very little legitimacy. Most people, not most, but enough people do not think capitalism is a legitimate mode of rule, right? The question is, how is that going to take up on a different form? That's one thing. And so what propelled that? I mean, a lot of things propel it. Some of it is just consciousness goes in ebbs and flows, right? This is normal. Another issue is the rise of China. And I neither have an opinion nor even care about how one characterizes China's internal social and political and ecological texture at the current moment. And so please don't ask me about that, because I don't even have an opinion. But what I do think is significant is that it has risen, right? China has risen, is taking up a huge share of global economic production, is endogenizing value, is building out renewable at a very rapid pace. This is a challenge to U.S. power. Again, I don't want to entertain whether that is a good challenge or a bad challenge, because I just don't care for the purposes of this book. But I do think it's a challenge, right? And there are accordingly there's a lot of thinking about how to react to that challenge. So this is part of the background against which we can interpret the rise of this discussion about a Green New Deal. It's one of a menu as it emerged from Ocasio-Cortez and kind of the political forces behind Ocasio-Cortez, and the way it's being taken up both to her right and to her left. It's a way of dealing with these crises in partial ways, right? And it's reflecting the debate both within, essentially within ruling class opinion, about how to react to political issues related to U.S. hegemony, issues related to accumulation, issues related to the restabilization of some form of hierarchical rule, which it may not anymore be useful to think of as capitalism, or it won't be capitalism at a certain point, if it's even still capitalism now, right? I think these are important to keep in mind, because this allows us to have a slightly different departing point, right? We can then see, okay, the primary Green New Deal debate amongst, say, liberals is primarily a debate about how to manage and re-empower U.S. empire. And this also allows us to have, I think, a more critical perspective of some of the more progressive, including self-branded eco-socialist proposals that do not sufficiently challenge imperialism and are actually really within the framework of modifications of the prevailing institutional, political, structural setup within the imperialist core, including mainly here speaking of the United States and the European Union. So against this background, I mean, very, very briefly, I have found it at least very useful to think about the reactions to the climate crisis proceeding along essentially 4 possible paths. And 3 of them are, in fact, arenas of debate amongst ruling class opinion, including those portions, that type of left opinion that is permitted, frankly, by the ruling class, right? Because it's always been the case that a spectrum of left opinion has been at the margins of ruling class thought, right? And I don't think it's useful to hide that as a structural feature of ideological management in our world, right? So what are those 4 possibilities, right? One possibility is a right-wing response to the climate crisis based on more or less fascism. It's not overt political control, hardened borders, extensive and further militarization, use of the military for labor mobilization, extreme use of population control, especially population control from the global south to the global north, extensive plans for the financialization of nature, increasing openness towards so-called natural climate solutions, extensive use of biofuels, extensive renewed primitive accumulation of southern natures, particularly those portions which will be slotted for biofuels or for biodiversity preservation, maintenance of the existing industrial infrastructure in the north at all costs, even if modified, and of course, no substantive change whatsoever in existing property relations, north or south. This is one model. I call this the green social control or green elite transition model, right? And you can see it. It's very important. One of the problems I think of our moment is that when you talk about things like this and you're like, no, this is what the ruling class is planning on doing. People are like, is that a conspiracy theory? It's like, well, one, it is a conspiracy theory because the ruling class is always conspiring. That's clear. But second of all, more importantly, we have all the documents, right? And I listed it all in my book. Everything is footnoted, more or less. Just check out if you have some time, check out the documents yourself. Check out the World Economic Forum documents. Check out the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative documents. Check out who's funding a lot of the discourse around veganism is funded by Swedish billionaires, the Storderling Foundation. Okay, these people are making ideas move in ways that are congenial to their interests. We need to identify that and be able to talk clearly about it without any huffing and puffing that confabulated. That's one thing. What is the next option? The next option for ruling class kind of response to the climate crisis is a spectrum that ranges roughly from Joe Biden to, and it has to be clear about this, Ocasio-Cortez, something like this, right? Something like the liberal solution. The liberal solution is not actually averse to the right-wing ruling class solution, but it has a much greater openness to anti-racist and social justice rhetoric. This includes, I think, a cynical deployment of the indigenous question in order to gain appeal and kind of allow it to be more smoothly digested and metabolized by kind of liberal opinion. This kind of talks about prison abolition. It may talk a little bit about food justice and so forth. It talks a lot about frontline and most vulnerable communities. What it doesn't talk about, of course, it goes without saying, it doesn't talk about things like climate debt. It doesn't talk about changes in the U.S. military. It does talk to some extent about reindustrialization, and it does talk to some extent about domestic socioeconomic inequality, but with an eye towards kind of dealing with it to some extent. And this is also critical to keep in mind. The Democrats people vote for them because they do a little something about domestic socioeconomic inequality, right? I mean, it's not that they don't do anything, it's that they do very little, and we would like them to, not that we would like, what we want is far more transformative, right? So this is essentially the spectrum from Ocasio-Cortez to Joe Biden. And there's still a lot of debate about how far that's going to go. The infrastructure bill keeps on getting hung up and so forth. And it's accompanied maybe with small criticisms of US foreign policy, but not in general. Calls for the maintenance of the US military, also calls explicitly, and this was in the Ocasio-Cortez document, for the US to be a new green tech leader, right? That was explicit. Now, I don't believe either of those plans, for that matter, in the short to medium term, have any interest in doing anything about carbon dioxide emissions, actually. I think that's important to keep in mind as well, right? They, there's very little ruling class constituency for actual mandatory caps on and reductions on emissions at the current moment. That's just the way things are, and this is a function of the time horizons capitalism works. This brings us to the third plan. I think the third way of thinking about it. The third is the blurriest because it involves a wide range of opinion, extending, a sliver to the left of Ocasio-Cortez, all the way to fairly transformative proposals, and not to mention even calls for socialism. Now, why is that third, and why do I think there's a fourth option, which I've tried to advocate working on demands from Bolivia and in conversation with a lot of other forces in the world? Why do I think that's separate from the fourth plan, which is more or less the one I very loosely tried to think about, at least in my book a little bit? The third plan is kind of the range of thinking going from green Keynesianism to green social democracy, right? And this is a wide range. I mean, this is the wide range of policies, if we're looking for historical precedent, ranging from like 1932 to 1970, right? And it is basically resting on the state playing a commanding role in alleviating poverty, setting in motion massive industrial change, actually getting to zero emissions by 2030, 2035 in the United States, rolling out a massive renewable energy infrastructure, putting in place a massive mass transit infrastructure, massively retrofitting buildings so that they become zero emissions. I mean, the people discussing this are honestly committed to a number of these goals that, again, are probably widely shared by progressive people. But there are also goals, but not always, right? If you look at, for example, the Robert Powell and Noam Chomsky, which I slot into this more or less, they don't call for getting to zero emissions by 2030. That's one example. That's one thing. Another thing is that these plans tend to rely on unrealistic measures of the capacity for renewables to replace current energy use, right? And most of these plans are fairly unrealistic, and they're extremely techno-optimist in terms of what technology can reasonably be expected to produce in the next 10 years. This is not to speak of what could happen in 100 years. 100 years is we're all dead. I mean, I don't think humanity is dead, but all of us on the call are dead. So it doesn't help us think about our issues, I think. So what is absent uniformly from these positions, right? Although they talk about anti-militarism and they talk about internationalism, they do not talk about climate debt. They don't talk about national sovereignty, not as the ceiling for what we aspire to the South, but as the floor for what the South needs in order to carry out internal, social, democratic, ecological change. They don't call for abolition of the US military, and they are very ambiguous, not to say ambivalent, about what they actually mean when they call for decolonization, even if, and often only discussing the United States, with Palestine usually ripped from the equation, let alone other instances of settler colonial depredation like Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, right? Those are all places where until very recent memory, or still is, settler monopoly, white control over the land. Those are settler colonial situations, right? But they aren't part of this discussion. Agriculture, almost uniformly absent in the progressive to even eco-socialist kind of progressive northern Green New Deal proposals. They don't know about agriculture and they don't care about agriculture. And this is again a reflection of the fact that this is written in the North and it's easy to ignore agriculture in the United States, right? But in the rest of the world, not so much, especially the South. They don't care about, they don't have any structural account or theory of imperialism, right? Imperialism and its kind of reverse coin internationalism are both sentimental rather than analytical, or theoretical or conceptual accounts of how exactly poor countries are kept poor within our world system. It's something we need to understand if we want to challenge it, right? This is missing. Also missing calls for global energy use convergence, very much absent from the social democratic proposals, right? Okay, so this brings us to my book, which I'm not going to talk about for too long because it's often more productive actually to answer questions about it from people who have read it than to pontificate about it. But very briefly, I mean, this book was written as a response to the hardening of that debate, right? And it was also written as a response to what I felt was things that were not accurate that were being said about the Ocasio-Cortez Green New Deal. And it being represented as eco-socialist when it wasn't. And to be clear, this doesn't mean it's either good or bad. I don't even have an opinion on it, that Ocasio-Cortez is up there putting forward these ideas. It's just that those are not eco-socialist ideas. And if we are eco-socialists, then we need to just be clear about what she's proposing and what the limits of it are. And also, to be clear, I actually had quite a lot of trouble getting articles about this published, reflecting this perspective. I think 4 or 5 articles and reviews of various lengths, all rejected, right? So I was like, okay, I'll write a book, right? But there is a disciplining factor, and this is to left-wing places I sent this, right? I mean, it was being disciplined about what I could or could not say. Anyway, I mean, I think it's relevant because I think it reflects it reflects an inability of portions of the left to really take an independent, autonomous perspective when it comes to how to change the world in very simple terms, right? And the left institutions, right? And a lot of the control of them by, NGOs who are ultimately funded by Rockefeller, right? And some of that is documented in the book too. It's not a conspiracy theory. That's just how things are at the moment. Now, what do I think is needed in order to arrive at an actual eco-socialist Green New Deal? I mean, I think things like global energy use convergence, climate debt repayments, national sovereignty, and I always feel the need to reaffirm this. National sovereignty, from my perspective, supporting it doesn't mean rallying behind whatever country government is in office in another country. It means respecting the right of self-determination within those countries. Those are two different things. That should not be conflated, and I find unproductive when people try and conflate it in their account of what I'm trying to argue for. That means comprehensive demilitarization of the United States. That means a lot more attention to agriculture, especially in the United States, full-scale transformation of the U.S. agricultural system associated with comprehensive agrarian reform with an attention to decolonization and Black land loss. That means totally shattering the inequality in land ownership in the United States, moving to agroecology, moving to a zero carbon agricultural system. In fact, this is low-hanging fruit. No one talks about this as low-hanging fruit. This is super low-hanging fruit because you can convert the agricultural system, have it produce more than enough food to feed the current population, have it protect more biodiversity, have it actually pull down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, have it be healthier, eliminate cancer plagues, eliminate larger ecosystem damages and pollutions. You can do all those things, right? No social shift actually produces more good for the population other than beyond this, right? And yet it is totally undiscussed in the mainstream proposals, right? So this is absolutely central. It also, of course, involves the dismantling of all forms of agribusiness and the progressive, if not immediate, extirpation of capitalism, of course, within the agrarian system and within U.S. society at large. What else? I mean, I discussed the internationalist aspects, and then there's the industrial aspects. I'm not an industrial planner, of course. I mean, I know a little bit about economic planning, but I do think it's worthwhile that we think more creatively and especially not only we, I actually don't know the composition of the group exactly, but that there needs to be more conversation between people who do know about sustainable design, sustainable building, shifts to sustainable forms of industrialization and so forth, and eco-socialists, right? And I don't want to say that isn't happening. I don't want to presume that people aren't doing that or thinking about doing that. But I think this is absolutely critical because there's a lot of creative work that can be done, going back historically, of course, all the way to the appropriate technology movement, but also going into the eco-design movement, eco-development, it was called in Latin America. That was literally called appropriate technology in the Arab region. It was very widespread in terms of interest about it. This was about thinking about how you can basically maintain complicated systems of social interchange, social interdependence, high technology, and yet embed it much more in the landscape by essentially thinking, okay, how can we have these closed systems? I mean, now this is going by terms like industrial metabolism, which I think is a misleading literature. But I think the idea behind it, which is that you can have much more closed kind of productive systems, you can think about what kind of things that are currently produced using essentially petroleum, but also metal, could be emphasized more by using wood, cloth, and so forth, which are all things that human beings, in my experience, generally prefer to these artificial products, right? And all of which are capable of being made with zero carbon. A lot of that, or carbon negative, which is, I've also documented in the book, like where I discussed bamboo, where I discussed estimates for life cycle estimates for carbon absorption using lumber from housing versus more carbon intensive production and so forth. So I think this is something that we need to engage about, especially because, and these last two things, especially industry and agriculture, these are things, New York is tough, of course, but these are places where local activists can plug in, right? This is stuff where local zoning, where there are probably ways of weaving relationships between municipal governments and local procurement, or you can pass local laws demanding certain types of production do or don't happen based on land use, or agriculture could be supported through universities can secure their food needs from local farms and so forth. There's a lot to do locally here that can actually build things up and kind of turn quantity into quality. So I think this is something very important, and specifically that portion of the book is meant as an exercise in opening up a conversation rather than setting out a program, because a program will necessarily be something that's 10,000 pages long, so it can fit for every municipality in the United States, right? So it's just some ideas to throw out to kind of open the debate. And in that spirit, I'm done presenting, and I open the floor to questions, comments, criticism.